Well, I was born in Africa, in Nigeria, and I lived there until I was about 6 years old, and then we were evacuated from there during the Biafran War. After that, my parents moved to Hong Kong, and we were raised there in a school. And when we came back to England again for a bit, and then off to the Bahamas, brief spell in the United States, then finally we settled in England for good. Yes, I do miss certain aspects of the countries I've lived in quite a bit. Obviously, something like the Bahamas, it's going to be the sea with the sailing and all the boating activities associated with that. I also miss Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a fascinating place because it was just so mesmerizing when you're a child. All the things that you could see in the shops and all the things like snake restaurants and this sort of thing, where you could go and eat the most exotic kinds of food. So I miss that sort of thing a lot. And what I try to do now, as much as possible when I'm not writing a book, is to actually get out there and travel and see as much of the world as I can. Because I think it's important as a writer that if you're going to write about a place, then you know at least what it feels like to be there. Well, I love England. Much as I have enjoyed living in other countries. The thing about England that I like is just it's so lush and green, and this is where, of course, I've raised my own children. So it feels like home for me and home for them. And at the moment, I particularly like it because I'm living in a house that's some 400 years old, and I'm spending a lot of my time when I'm not writing, actually putting it back together again because it was sadly neglected, and so it's become a bit of a project for me and my family. Well, I think it's mostly when you travel around the Mediterranean, and particularly in places where there's been a Roman presence from the days of the Roman Empire. The thing that impresses you is the scale upon which the Romans built. In France, for example, we went on holiday and saw the Pont du Gard, which is this vast viaduct that goes across this valley. Absolutely extraordinary piece of engineering. And then, of course, you get to go to places like Pompeii, Rome, and if you go further afield, there are plenty of Roman towns and remains in Turkey. So it's just the whole of the Mediterranean is kind of ringed by Roman memorials of one kind or another. So they're incredibly prolific race of people. And also the thing that impresses is just how advanced they were in certain aspects. So when you go to Pompeii, for example, one of the things that strikes you is, as you're walking down the street, is to see the plumbing for the water supplies and the sewer and so on. And it's really quite impressive. So it's this sense of a very highly evolved ancient people, but at the same time they're very, very different from us. I mean, they loved gladiator fighting and blood sports and things that in this day and age would just be unthinkable. So there's a lot there to impress. Well, of the Roman remains that I've visited, there have been some quite good ones in Britain, actually. The idea for the whole Roman series getting me involved in writing about Rome was down to a visit to a Roman fort, the remains of a Roman fort up at Housteads on Hadrian's Wall. And it's an absolutely fantastic sight. And as soon as I saw it, I could quite easily visualize what the Romans would have looked like and how Roman life might have been. But the ones that really impressed me, apart from the obvious ones like Rome, Pompeii and so on, are places like Qasr Bashir in the Jordanian desert, which is the best preserved Roman fort anywhere in the world. And the reason it's so well preserved is because there are no kind of towns nearby so that people can take the stones of the fort and use them to rebuild something else. So it's almost intact, which is quite an amazing thing. And if anybody gets the chance to go and see a Roman site anywhere in the world, that's one of the ones that would be top of my list. The other one that really impresses me is the remains of the Villa Jovis on Capri. That is one of my favourite spots on the earth, simply because the view from the end of the walkway that crosses the island is absolutely spectacular. Yeah, Hadrian's Wall is quite an extraordinary engineering achievement. 75 miles or so long from one coast of Britain to the other. I have actually walked the entire length of it with some friends a few years ago, and it's a lovely walk to do. But it just, it's one of these things. Again, it impresses you about the Romans that there is no project so big that they won't consider it. And it's quite an extraordinary thing. Every bunch of students that I've taken to see Hadrian's Wall, they've all been absolutely been astonished by it. Accuracy is very important for me. I think one of the parts of the agreement, if you like, the contract between the writer and the reader, is that it's vital that you get your facts right as far as possible. Sometimes, of course, you're going to have to make a compromise, because if you're telling a story, and I am a novelist as well as a historian, then it's important, if I'm going to tell a good story, to make sure the story comes first. So that may mean that you sort of tweak a little fact now and again. But frankly, history is just so astonishing quite often that there's absolutely no need to make stuff up. History is already pretty good at telling a story. Well, history is a really important subject. It's one of my favourite subjects when I was at school, and it's certainly one of the subjects I would like students to be really, really fascinated by, because it is the story of our race. From thousands of years ago, we can learn by looking at it, where we've come from, what makes us the people we are, and if we're any good at all, we can also learn from our mistakes. One of the things that really disappoints me as a historian and as a novelist and as a human being is the degree to which politicians and people don't learn the lessons of history. It is just one of those things that really astonishes me and makes me very, very cross and sad, because there's so much tragedy that could be avoided if people spent a little bit more time learning history and learning the lessons of history. The story of Gladiator originated from my sons, actually. We were in the habit of walking across a field to school every day when I would take them in the morning. And I would begin by telling a story. And as we got to the school gate, I would say, and we'll find out tomorrow what became of our particular hero. And one of the stories I started telling was about a boy gladiator, Marcus. And so I'd get to the school gate and we'd end that particular episode. The next day we'd start another sort of tale or continue one. And eventually one of my sons said, well, why don't you write that as a book? I mean, we're really enjoying it. And I'm sure plenty of other young readers will as well. So I thought, okay, fair enough, I'll do that. I've written quite a lot of stuff for adults, but I thought I'd write this one for a younger market. Principally, as I said, I had in mind my two sons when I was writing this. And it was a lot of fun to tell. At the present, I'm actually writing the third book in the series, and my publishers here in the UK are considering another two books after the fourth book is done. So this could be turn out to be quite a long series, and I'm loving every minute of it. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's quite funny, I suppose, about Gladiator is that the protagonist, Marcus, his main thing that changes his world is based upon a nightmare version of my childhood, because we were living in Hong Kong. When we were living in Hong Kong, my father used to take my mother out for parties, and my father's a dreadful driver, he really is. And my anxiety was that, what if they went out to a party, he had a bit to drink, didn't drive home terribly well, and straight over a cliff or something? So what would happen to me and my brothers then? So I'm afraid I was a deeply kind of insecure child, I suppose. And what I would do is I'd go out and spend all my pocket money on buying tins of food to hide under my bed in case there came the day when my father didn't return home with my mother. Now, that told me something quite interesting, that my number one fear as a child was the prospect of losing my parents. Then I asked my sons about this, and they said exactly the same thing. The thing that most terrifies them in the world is the thought of losing myself and my wife. And I thought, well, if that's the same for me and it's the same thing, why the hell shouldn't it be the same for a little Roman boy? And what would life be like for a Roman boy if, after living this idyllic childhood, suddenly he loses everything? His father, his mother, his home, and he's forced to go into a gladiator school, the harshest possible environment any young child could possibly be. How would he cope? And that's the idea of where the idea for the story really came. Sadly, yes, I have witnessed a few violent episodes in my life. If you recall, I was saying that I was born in Africa, and we were living there at the time of the Biafran War. So we were living on the side which was losing around Port Harcourt, and for a number of weeks we were bombed by the Federal Air Force. And then finally, when the Federal Army was about to take Port Harcourt, we were evacuated pretty much at the last moment. And it was a pretty traumatic time. Loads of people I'd known as a boy that were killed in the war, and there were loads of people like my family who we lost everything, our house, our property. My father basically just came into my bedroom one night and said, "Pack your bags, we're leaving this house, leaving Nigeria in 2 minutes' time." And so I had to leave everything I ever owned. So did my family. And then when we turned up in the UK, all we had, essentially, were the clothes that we were wearing on our backs, and that's it. It was a very, very tragic episode, and frankly, if any child could be spared the horrors of war, then that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Roman times, yeah, they were really violent. The Romans thrived on violence. You only have to look at things, the phenomenon of the gladiator games. There is something that is absolute proof that the Romans' greatest pleasure was seeing other people hack each other to death. And also, you don't get to be the dominating world power of the age unless you are a pretty violent race of people at the same time. So the Romans and violence kind of go together. They really do. And of course that's good for a storyteller like me, because that means I'll never be short of any stories to tell readers like you. It's tempting not to give you an answer to this one, simply because no storyteller wants to sort of provide the ending and spoil the whole story in the process. It would be nice, let's put it that way, if Marcus finds his mother in the end, and I think it's almost impossible to conceive of the story ending any other way. But there will be other adventures for Marcus following on from that. So I'll be looking forward to, when the first 4 books are done, coming up with another, say, 3, 4 books with a completely different adventure for Marcus to get involved with.